I was at the Fed when Kevin Warsh was a governor. I've, watched him in action as a policymaker. I've certainly followed his comments since then. I mean, there's a lot about his track record and his recent comments about what we see in the economy and what's appropriate for interest rates. All that said, I think the conversation about Kevin Warsh, and again today, he got the nomination. He's not the Fed chair yet. He needs to go before the Senate. And I think the hearing, his confirmation hearing, should be a pretty difficult one. Because right now, the big conversation is about the independence of the Fed. Will it be free from political influence in setting interest rates? And there's some comments from Kevin Warsh I think he needs to be asked about. And that goes before all his views on the economy.
So, Claudia, what do you think the Fed should be thinking about right now? Again, it's got that dual mandate here, and we're getting more and more data as we speak here. What do you think the focus should be or is for the Fed right now?
Well, the Fed's focus should be its dual mandate. It should be about maintaining maximum employment and getting inflation back to the 2% target using the tools that it has. I mean, this is where, the unemployment rate is below 4.5%. The inflation rate is around 3%, much lower than it was, just a few years ago. But, it's not all the way back to target. So I think their job is not done. But I don't see this as a moment where we need to have, as Kevin Warsh has talked about, a regime change, come in and knock heads, right? There's work to be done. There needs to be a continuity, a continued focus on the two sides of the mandate. And if we have a disruption to that, that could be, really problematic in general.
Paul, was that Claudia Sahm shade? Is that what we just
I don't know, maybe a little bit.
Shade there.
Claudia, how do you think Mr. Warsh will work with, interact with, deal with the other members of the Fed here if he is confirmed?
The public comments that he's made in recent months suggest that he's going to come in on a pretty combative footing. I mean, he's used words like knock some heads. He's been very critical of the Fed. I mean, he went so far as to accuse the Fed of its rate cuts in 2024 as the unemployment rate was rising, that was political, right? That's a really serious accusation to make. The Fed was reacting to a labor market that looked like it might be unraveling. Right. So I think he's going to come in, the Fed works by consensus. By his own remarks, I think he's going to have a tough time building consensus, but he is capable of doing that. It's just, it's going to be could be a rocky transition.
Claudia Sahm with us. We're thrilled to have her here in the 9 o'clock hour. Do we have Paul yet when we're going to get a press conference?
I have not seen
with the President of the United States. We don't have it yet. But again, for those joining, a nominee as chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Kevin Warsh, this morning. We've heard from Christopher Waller on his dissent. I'm sure we'll hear from others through the day. I want to emphasize here, and again, folks, this comes down to the pedigree. Claudia Sahm, Michigan PhD, absolutely definitive and trying to understand the quarter-to-quarter gyrations of recession. Or Richard Clarida, the vice chairman, and all of his work at Columbia, where he literally herded cats at Columbia for years, and his work with a strange thing called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory. Dr. Sahm, Lawyer Powell, I guess we really didn't know what he was going to do other than he was a finance guy. What was the song last summer? Looking for a finance guy?
Oh, yeah,
6'5".
Right.
He was blue-eyed and 6'5". Claudia Sahm, do you have any real understanding of Attorney Warsh's economics?
Warsh has said in interviews in recent months, last year, he was very critical of the models that the Fed uses, has, called them outdated, has, really pushed the idea that we need a new thinking. I mean, one of the things, Powell came in, he was not a dyed-in-the-wool monetary policy theorist, but he came in as a governor and then continued on his chair as really listening to the experts around him, building his understanding, relying on their expertise, being very data-driven.
Okay, well, let me interrupt, because this is the heart of the matter, Dr. Sahm. You worked with Warsh at the Fed. Do you suggest he will mimic the pattern of Governor Powell, or is there going to be a different approach here where he does not listen to Fed PhDs?
I'm reacting to comments that he made just within the last year. Not, it's over a decade ago when he was a governor. I think, we really need to listen to what he's been saying recently. And he's been extremely critical of the Fed models, extremely critical of the staff and the current Fed officials. So, I think he'll be different than Powell, and it could be different in a way that's disruptive and not productive.
Claudia, I'm looking at a note from Ben Emmons at Highline Asset Management in which he says, quote, Warsh has made it explicitly clear in his Hoover Institution interview in May of 2025 that the Fed is responsible for interest rates, the administration is responsible for the budget, and that this should be the basis for a new Fed Treasury accord. How radical or out of consensus is that?
It's extremely radical and out of consensus. My biggest concern with Warsh, and I think this is something that he should be asked about by the Senate, right? Like, let him explain more his thinking on it. I don't want to prejudge, but I mean, he's talked about that there needs to be a coordination. He used those words, a coordination between the White House and Treasury on the balance sheet. We need to remember the Fed's balance sheet is an instrument of monetary policy. The Fed has used it to influence long-term interest rates. Short-term political interests of the White House have no business in that conversation.
Revisit a decade ago. I mean, I was at I read only important papers at bars.
Of course.
So, like 15 years ago, I'm at this great Greek restaurant in Midtown, reading 48 pages of Geithner, the world was blowing up, or that. Claudia, take us back to Governor Warsh. And the basic idea that he said we shouldn't ease, and I'm saying this in a very general statement, I want you to tell us, was he against accommodation in the heat of the battle of the crisis?
Governor Warsh participated in helping stabilize financial markets. Right. In the global financial crisis, he was, worked very closely with Chairman Bernanke on, trying to figure out how to stabilize financial markets. He worked on the first asset purchases quantitative easing. As it moved into the unemployment rate is near 10% and the economy is really weakening, Warsh got very concerned about inflation and was very critical of the Fed using asset purchases to support the economy. It doesn't make any sense. Inflation was not a problem then. Unemployment was the problem. And in the many years after that, he hasn't revisited that and said it was a mistake. So that's where I think his credibility on the labor market is really thin.
And Paul, I'm going to interject here. The wonderful and late and dearly missed Charles Plosser also was worried about inflation, and he came out and said I was wrong. I mean, this was a raging debate. McKee lived this, but at the time. But this is a really important distinction, folks, that maybe will be in the question. Paul, get one more in here with Dr. Sahm.
Dr. Sahm, how contentious are you anticipating a contentious confirmation process for this nominee?
Yes, I am. And I think that's appropriate. I mean, given the moment the Fed is in, these are not normal times. And it's the Senate's job, right? Like, they are supposed to vet the candidate, make sure they have the expertise. And this time around, it is so important that there are very clear lines drawn between the White House and the Fed, and that the Fed chair can really back up that they're going to continue that independence, because it matters for all Americans. It matters for financial markets and stability. So I think it should be a tough hearing, but that's the way it should be.